The weather is starting to warm up here. Spring is right around the corner. And this is the time of year that people start thinking about their garden. I've made a few attempts at growing some plants out here in the high desert. Some failures and some successes, more failures than successes. But I've learned a lot of lessons. And in this video, I'll share them with you, and hopefully they'll help them in your garden. Plants are plants. A tomato is a tomato, corn is corn, and they want what they want. So even if you're not in the high desert, if your plants are struggling, this video will talk about some of the reasons that could be. The video could be helpful for you no matter where you live. The calendar is very important to plants. They know when spring is coming and when winter is coming. Their survival depends on it. Sometimes these plants know better than we do. And every plant has its own needs for the elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And even when the plant has everything it needs and it's growing and thriving, we still need to protect it from pests and other things that want to eat it, besides us, of course. So stick around as I dive into the details. My name is Joe. I bought 5 acres of raw land in the high deserts of Arizona, and I am building an off-grid homestead. Welcome to my channel, Off-Grid Solitude. Let's talk about the calendar and gardening. It's starting to warm up here. Recently, we've had temperatures close to 80. But in general, it's been in the 60s most days. The animals are starting to return, birds are singing, but the nights are still cool, sometimes dipping into the 30s, but we haven't had a frost in a while. When the weather is like this, people naturally start thinking about their garden. But don't be fooled. Even though there are a few sprouts here and there, a few blades of green grass coming out of the ground, there are still no buds on the trees. There are no insects crawling around or reptiles. It's still pretty cold. But us humans are so anxious to start our garden that every year we jump the gun and we plant too early. That's why they developed an almanac. They write down these dates of when we should start planting and harvesting so we don't forget. In fact, it's some of the oldest writing there is. Through the experience of generations upon generations, they've narrowed down the last frost date of the spring. That's the date that for a given location, it's a pretty safe bet there won't be another frost. And around here, that's mid-April, which seems pretty late. In April, temperatures get into the 80s. And it's beautiful weather, downright hot, but it only takes one stray storm or one cold front to get those nighttime temperatures to dip. And all your tender little sprouts are dead. So make sure to look up your last frost date for your area and believe what it says. Unless, of course, you like ordering more seeds and planting all over again. Of course, with indoor heating, we can trick nature and start our seeds early indoors. And with some plants, it's a necessity because of their long growing season, like peppers, for example. And I've tried that with some success. But living in an RV, it just gets too hot in the daytime and too cold in the nighttime for that to really work. The little seedlings really struggle. But the biggest problem is the winter sun. There's just not enough hours of daylight for those seeds. My seedlings became leggy, and the stems were too thin, they fell over, and all died. In the past, I solved that problem with a grow light. But living here off-grid, I really don't have the power for that anymore. Now that I've talked about the calendar, let's go to our first element, the earth. The soil here is just not great. It's a lot of gravel and a lot of clay too. So when it gets soaked, it dries out into adobe and becomes very compact. Although grasses and trees have strong enough roots to penetrate it, it's much too dense for typical garden plants. But I don't have to worry too much about that because mixing in a little compost with the soil will solve that problem. But then we have the next issue with the soil is soil pH. Each plant has its own specific requirements for pH and nutrients in the soil. Raw virgin soil usually doesn't have the right pH for garden plants. Whether you're in the desert here or maybe you just cleared a patch of forest. The desert is usually too alkaline and forest soil is much too acidic. Soil pH is a measure of how acidic or alkaline the soil is. Soil is usually between 3 and 10 on the scale, with 3 being very acidic, 10 being very alkaline, and 7 being neutral. You can look up for each plant the range where the plant will survive, as well as the optimal range where you'll get the best harvest from that plant. The pH here in my soil is 7.5, which is pretty alkaline, and most plants don't like that at all, but some will tolerate it. But again, compost comes to the rescue. When you mix compost with the soil, it can nudge that pH a little bit. It can make alkaline or acidic soil less so. There are other additives as well. For example, sulfur will make soil more acidic. But they aren't miracle cures. A plant that likes very acidic soil will never be happy here, no matter how much sulfur I add. The best way to address the problem is to pick the right plants. For example, garlic and onions are okay with an alkaline soil. Also, squash. I had a pretty successful batch of yellow crookneck squash last year. I had a little bit of a harvest too. But probably the best and easiest way to address the problem is not to use the soil. Plant in containers and either buy or mix your own soil that has the right pH. And I tried that with some tomatoes and a few potatoes. I took a storage bin and I filled it with compost and good soil, and the plants grew pretty well. But there were other issues, and that takes us to our next element, air. Plants need air, especially the ones growing here on land. But something you may not realize is that the roots need air as well. If the soil is too wet or too dense, it can choke out the roots and the plant will die. Compost will solve that problem by keeping the soil nice and fluffy and letting that air in there. But access to air isn't the only issue. Out here in the desert, the wind is just terrible and fierce. We have occasional windstorms where the gusts hit 50 plus miles an hour. That can damage plants and buildings. Between windstorms, there's usually a constant breeze. Sometimes only a few mile-an-hour breeze, but it's here every single day. And the plants don't really like that. It dries them out, and even a small breeze can damage a tender leaf or a new shoot. The plants that did the best out here were growing next to a building that could shield them from the wind, or even bushes or some trees that can just block that wind a little bit. Buildings and trees can also shield our plants from another element, fire. Now, I'm not talking about wildfires, although that is an issue out here, but I'm talking about the blazing sun. In July and August, and possibly even June through September, that afternoon desert sun is just too strong for most plants. it burns them and dries them out. Pretty much the only thing that can survive it are the native desert plants. So shade is really important. Even if a plant says it likes full sun, they're not talking about the desert sun. Now, buildings and shrubs and other obstacles can provide shade, but also shade cloths. Shade cloths are just a mesh or a netting that blocks some of the sun, and they're usually rated as a percentage, 50% blockage or 80%, 90% blockage. Here in the desert, you usually want at least 50%, but in other climates, probably less. The sun also brings a lot of heat, and most garden plants don't tolerate a lot of heat. They either suffer or just stop growing when the temperatures get too much above the 90s. And that's kind of a common temperature out here, so plants need to be kept cool. The shade cloth really helps with that. But it's also important not to place your plants next to something that can absorb that summer heat and radiate it back, like a large rock or a concrete retaining wall. Those can all cook a plant. Also, raised beds can be an issue out here. Plants like their roots to be cool. And if it gets too warm, that can also harm the plant. So a lot of times we sink our garden beds into the ground instead of raise it up. This keeps the roots cool, but it also can help funnel the water when it does rain into the garden bed. And that brings us to our last element on the list, water. Water is hard to come by in the desert. But not only that, the soil doesn't absorb water very quickly. It just runs right off. And when it does absorb it, it doesn't hold on to it. It passes right through. But again, compost will help hold some of that water, help it absorb into the soil, as well as some kind of a mulch. It'll prevent that water from evaporating right out of the soil again. It's also a good idea to put your water exactly where the plants need it. By shaping the soil in those sunken beds or with irrigation ditches, you can bring the water exactly to the plant's roots. Another option is a drip irrigation system that's even more precise. Over the past couple of growing seasons, I figured out all these obstacles and had some success in getting around them. But once my plants started to thrive, deer and wild pig would come and eat all my plants. So I built a small fence around my garden. But deer can jump and pigs can pick up a fence with their tusks. Insects aren't usually a big problem in the desert when it's dry. But when the rains come, there's usually a population explosion of insects afterwards. And that can be a problem for your plants when all those hungry bugs find it. So fences and nettings are very important. If you combine all of these problems and solutions, usually you end up making some sort of a hoop house. And I see a lot of them around. In other parts of the country, they work as a greenhouse, but here we don't need to keep that heat in. So they're usually covered with that shade cloth. And the bottom parts usually have netting and fencing to keep out the pests. When they work right, they keep out the sun, the wind, the heat, the pests, and hopefully keep in the moisture. And they can be built pretty inexpensively. And hopefully I'll have some videos of that to show you once the growing season starts. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next video.